Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we return to another story lost in the shadows of history, a case that still whispers through time, refusing to be forgotten. In December 2002, the small city of Modesto, California, was glowing with Christmas lights and quiet anticipation for the holidays. Families were wrapping gifts, neighbors were sharing food, and for one young couple, Scott and Laci Peterson, life seemed full of promise. Laci was 8 months pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Connor. She was described as warm, cheerful, and excited to become a mother. Friends recalled how she loved decorating her home, cooking, and walking her golden retriever, Mackenzie, through the neighborhood every morning. But just as the year was about to close, everything changed. On Christmas Eve, Laci suddenly vanished. One moment she was preparing for a family dinner, and the next she was gone without a trace. Her husband, Scott, told police that he had left home early that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away. When he returned later that day, the house was quiet. The dog was found wandering the street with its leash still attached, and Laci was nowhere to be found. At first, the community came together in hope. Flyers appeared on street corners. Volunteers searched fields and rivers, and news stations across the country began broadcasting her photo, a smiling woman with dark hair, expecting her first child. The nation held its breath, hoping she would be found alive. But as days turned into weeks, hope started to fade, and suspicion began to grow. Scott's calm demeanor during interviews and his inconsistent statements soon caught the public's attention. The story transformed from a missing person search into a national obsession. What had begun as a heartbreaking disappearance was now shadowed by whispers of betrayal, secrets, and lies. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered a second story beneath the surface, one involving an affair, unusual financial activity, and a timeline that did not seem to match. Yet despite the rumors, there was no physical evidence of a crime, only questions and a husband who claimed he had nothing to hide. Months later, when the remains of Laci and her unborn son were discovered along the shores of the San Francisco Bay, the tone of the story shifted forever. What was once a case of hope became one of heartbreak and anger. The world wanted answers. But as time went on, the story of Laci Peterson would grow even larger than the crime itself. It would raise questions about the justice system, media influence, and how a single tragedy could divide a nation for decades. Tonight, we begin at the start of that story, not with a verdict, but with a moment in time when everything seemed normal and the future still felt bright. This is the beginning of one of America's most haunting mysteries, the disappearance of Laci Peterson. Months passed after Laci Peterson vanished, and the city of Modesto slowly returned to routine, but the Peterson home never did. The yellow ribbons tied to streetlights had faded, and volunteers who once searched the rivers and open fields began to lose hope. What started as a community rescue effort had turned into a long, quiet wait for answers. Then, in April 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci disappeared, 2 separate discoveries along the San Francisco Bay changed everything. First, a passerby walking his dog near the shore found the remains of a small child. The next day, only a short distance away, the partial remains of a woman surfaced. Investigators soon confirmed the unthinkable. It was Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The discovery broke through every news channel in America. For weeks, people had followed the case, the missing mother, the desperate husband, the prayers for a miracle. Now, those hopes were gone. The story transformed from missing person to murder investigation. Detectives turned their attention once more to Scott Peterson, who had maintained that he was fishing at the marina the day Laci vanished, the same bay where her body was now found. That coincidence was impossible to ignore. It immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Police quietly began tracking Scott's movements. They noticed that his once neat appearance had changed. He had dyed his hair, was living out of his car, and was carrying large amounts of cash and camping gear. To investigators, it looked like someone preparing to disappear. Within days, he was arrested. For the nation, the case now had all the elements of a tragedy that felt both intimate and cinematic: love, loss, deception, and mystery. Every photo of Laci smiling in front of her Christmas tree was replayed on television beside Scott's mugshot. People debated endlessly. Was he a grieving husband or a man hiding something darker? What made the case even more complicated was that there was no clear physical evidence linking Scott to the deaths: no weapon, no witness, no confession. The prosecution would later rely on circumstantial details: his strange phone calls, his changing stories, and his affair with another woman. But in that moment, what mattered most was that the search had ended. The quiet waters of the San Francisco Bay had returned what they had hidden, and with them came 1,000 questions. Who had harmed Laci and her child? When had it happened? And why there, in the same place her husband had gone fishing? For investigators, the answers seemed obvious. For many others, they never would be. By the time Scott Peterson went to trial in 2004, the story had already gripped America. News outlets camped outside the courthouse. Every headline, every new detail became part of a national conversation about guilt, trust, and how well we really know the people closest to us. The courtroom in Redwood City was packed daily with reporters and spectators. Inside sat Scott Peterson, calm, clean-cut, often taking notes, rarely showing emotion. The prosecution painted him as a man living a double life: a husband expecting a child on one side, and on the other, someone who longed for freedom and had begun an affair with another woman. That woman, Amber Fry, became one of the trial's most important witnesses. She told the jury that she had met Scott just weeks before Laci vanished, and that he had introduced himself as single. When the news broke about Laci's disappearance, Amber contacted police and agreed to record her phone calls with him. In those calls, Scott could be heard lying, changing his stories, and even pretending to be in Europe when he was actually at Laci's vigil. The prosecution used these tapes to argue that Scott was not mourning, he was manipulating. They claimed he killed his wife to escape responsibility and start a new life. Prosecutors pointed out that the location where he went fishing was the same place where the bodies were later found, and they argued that this was no coincidence. The defense, however, fought back hard. They reminded the jury that no direct evidence connected Scott to the deaths: no eyewitness, no DNA, no weapon. They argued that the police had built their case on assumptions and media pressure, not proof. The defense also questioned the timeline, suggesting that Laci could have been abducted later by someone else. For months, testimony continued: experts, neighbors, police officers, even friends. Every word was analyzed, every expression discussed on television talk shows. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the world waited. On November 12, 2004, the verdict was read: guilty of first-degree murder for Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. As the decision was announced, sobs filled the courtroom. Some felt justice had finally been served. Others were still uncertain, uneasy that a man could face death based mostly on circumstantial evidence. Months later, the same jury recommended the death penalty. Scott Peterson was sent to California's death row at San Quentin Prison, just miles from the bay where Laci's body was found. For many, the case seemed closed, a tragic story with a clear ending. But for others, questions lingered. Was the evidence truly solid? Could there have been another explanation? Those doubts would not fade with time. Instead, they would return years later, when new advocates and investigators began to reopen the files determined to find out whether justice had truly been done. More than 15 years after the verdict, the Scott Peterson case returned to headlines once again, this time not because of new evidence, but because of a legal question, one that would change his fate. In 2020, the California Supreme Court reviewed his appeal. The issue was not whether Scott was guilty, but whether his death sentence had been handled fairly. At the heart of the matter was the role of a single juror, juror number 7, whose actions years earlier raised doubts about whether the trial had truly been impartial. During jury selection back in 2004, the court had asked all potential jurors whether they had ever been involved in a criminal case or felt personally threatened by violence. This particular juror, a woman named Rochelle Nice, said no. But years later, it was discovered that she had once sought a restraining order while pregnant against her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend after feeling threatened. That detail, though seemingly small, became critical. The defense argued that she had concealed her past and might have been biased against Scott because his case also involved a pregnant woman and domestic tension. The Supreme Court agreed that her omission created a potential problem. While the conviction itself remained intact, the death sentence was overturned, citing significant juror misconduct. The justices ruled that Scott Peterson had not received a fair penalty phase, even though they upheld the jury's finding of guilt. This decision meant that after nearly 2 decades on death row at San Quentin Prison, Scott's punishment would change to life imprisonment without parole. He was later moved out of San Quentin, ending one of the longest-standing death row cases in modern California history. For the Peterson family, the ruling reopened old wounds. Laci's relatives spoke publicly about their frustration, calling the decision a painful reminder of the past. They believed that justice had already been served, that the death sentence, not life imprisonment, was the right outcome. Meanwhile, Scott's defense team saw the ruling as a chance to go further. They used the court's acknowledgement of juror misconduct as the foundation for new appeals, arguing that if the penalty phase had been unfair, perhaps the entire conviction deserved review. The news reignited public debate. Some saw the decision as a technical correction, others as the first sign that the case might not be as clear-cut as once believed. Legal experts noted that California had already placed a moratorium on executions, meaning even without the ruling, Peterson likely would not have faced the death penalty soon. Still, the reversal carried powerful symbolic weight. 2 decades after Laci's disappearance, the story was once again in the public eye, no longer as a closed case, but as a legal puzzle still shifting with time. The man once sentenced to die was now fighting, once again, to prove that his story was not over. 2 decades after Laci Peterson's disappearance, the case that once seemed settled found itself pulled back into the spotlight. The man convicted of her murder, Scott Peterson, was no longer facing execution, but he was still determined to prove his innocence. In 2024, a new group stepped in to help him, the Los Angeles Innocence Project LAP, an organization known for re-examining old convictions where mistakes or misconduct might have occurred. The LAP filed an 854-page petition on Scott's behalf, claiming that new evidence could change everything. Their argument was not about emotions or sympathy, it was about the facts. They claimed the original investigation had ignored or mishandled key details that might have pointed to someone else entirely. According to the petition, several witnesses had reported seeing Laci alive after the time prosecutors said she was already dead. Others mentioned a burglary that took place across the street from the Peterson home around the same day she disappeared, a crime police confirmed but dismissed as unrelated. The Innocence Project argued that this burglary could have been the key to what really happened. even more striking were the claims about physical evidence. Investigators had once found a burned-out van near Modesto containing a mattress stained with what looked like blood, but that material was never fully tested for DNA. LAIP demanded that modern technology be used to re-examine such evidence, arguing that forensic science in 2002 was far less advanced than it is today. The group also requested a new analysis of the duct tape found attached to Laci's clothing, something that, until then, had never undergone complete DNA testing. In 2024, a California court approved their motion, granting permission to test the material for potential foreign DNA. It was a small but significant step. For the first time in 20 years, science might have a say in the case again. Beyond the evidence, the petition challenged the prosecution's timeline of death, claiming that medical data and fetal development studies suggested Laci and her unborn son may have died days later than officially recorded, possibly at a time when Scott had a verified alibi. If true, it would strike at the heart of the state's theory. However, the court's response was cautious. In mid-2025, the California Court of Appeal rejected most of the Innocence Project's arguments, ruling that the evidence was not strong enough to justify a new trial. Still, the judges allowed limited retesting and further review in lower courts, leaving a narrow path open. For Scott Peterson, it was another sliver of hope. For Laci's family, it felt like reopening an old wound. Two sides of the same tragedy, one seeking freedom, the other seeking closure, both trapped in a story that refuses to end. When the Los Angeles Innocence Project took on Scott Peterson's case, they did not just question the verdict, they questioned the foundation on which it was built. Their petition detailed a list of new evidence claims that, if proven accurate, could reshape how the world views one of America's most famous murder convictions. At the center of their argument were three major claims: eyewitness accounts that contradicted the state's timeline, overlooked crime scenes near the Peterson home, and physical evidence that had never been fully tested. The first claim focused on sightings of Laci Peterson after the morning she supposedly vanished. Multiple residents in the Modesto area had reported seeing a pregnant woman walking a golden retriever Laci's dog on the very same day she was declared missing. Some of these witnesses even provided specific times that, if accurate, would mean Laci was alive long after Scott had left to go fishing. The defense argued that these accounts were either ignored or downplayed by investigators eager to close in on a suspect. The second claim revolved around a burglary that occurred across the street from the Peterson home. The break-in took place around December 24th, the same morning Laci disappeared. The defense proposed that Laci might have witnessed the crime and confronted the burglars, leading to her death. Police had acknowledged the burglary early in the investigation, but later dismissed it as unrelated. The Innocence Project argued that the dismissal was premature and that evidence from that crime scene had never been properly analyzed. The third, and perhaps most significant claim, involved forensic re-examination. The LAIP petition emphasized that science in 2002 was far less advanced than it is today. Items such as duct tape, rope, and fibers collected from the Bay Area could now be retested with new DNA technology capable of identifying microscopic traces that older methods might have missed. Among these items was a piece of duct tape found attached to Laci's clothing. The new defense team requested permission to test it for foreign DNA skin cells, sweat, or hair from anyone other than Laci or Scott. In 2024, the court approved that request, marking the first time in over 20 years that physical evidence from the case would be analyzed with modern forensic tools. They also pointed to a burned-out van found nearby, containing a mattress stained with what looked like blood. For reasons still unclear, that sample was never fully tested during the original investigation. The LAIP claimed this could have been critical evidence linking Laci's disappearance to a different suspect altogether. In short, the Innocence Project argued that the case against Scott Peterson relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and public perception, not science. And now, with new technology, they wanted to test what time had left behind. The question is, will those tests finally reveal the truth or only deepen the mystery? In modern criminal justice, time can be both an enemy and an ally. It can fade memories, but it can also sharpen truth through science. That is exactly what is happening now in the Laci Peterson case, where advances in forensic technology are giving old evidence a second life. When the case was first investigated in 2002, DNA testing was still developing. Laboratories could identify genetic profiles, but trace materials such as touch DNA, the microscopic cells left by skin contact, were rarely recoverable. 2 decades later, new technology allows scientists to test smaller, older samples with far greater precision. The Los Angeles Innocence Project, LAIP, used this progress to argue that critical evidence collected from the scene and from Laci's recovered clothing deserved a second look. One of the most important items was a piece of duct tape that had been attached to her clothing when she was found. The tape had never undergone full modern DNA analysis. In 2024, a California court approved retesting a rare decision in such an old and high-profile case. Experts were tasked with using the latest forensic tools to determine whether foreign DNA might be present. That meant searching for even the faintest trace, a single skin cell, a strand of hair, a fiber that did not belong to Laci or Scott Peterson. If any new profile appeared, it could open the door to previously unexplored leads. But the duct tape was not the only piece of interest. Investigators also revisited the burned-out van discovered near Modesto at the time of Laci's disappearance. Inside was a mattress marked by reddish stains that had never been conclusively tested. The Innocence Project asked for new DNA testing using modern methods such as YSTR analysis, which can identify male DNA even in heavily degraded samples. At the same time, the defense requested permission to re-examine soil and debris found in Scott's boat evidence, once cited to suggest he had dumped Laci's body. Using modern sediment analysis, experts hope to determine whether that material actually came from the San Francisco Bay or somewhere else entirely. While courts have allowed limited testing, the process remains slow and heavily monitored. Every step must be approved, and both sides, prosecution and defense, must agree on chain of custody procedures to ensure no contamination. Forensic breakthroughs, if they come, are measured in months, not days. Still, the mere act of reopening this evidence has stirred public fascination. Many wonder what science might reveal after all these years. Could DNA finally confirm what happened, or would it only deepen the mystery? For now, the testing continues quietly inside sterile labs, behind closed doors, while the rest of the world waits. 2 decades later, even a single microscopic clue could change the direction of a story that once seemed finished. Every major case has its alternate theories, versions of the story that live in the margins of police reports and court transcripts. For the Laci Peterson case, the most persistent of these theories centers not on the husband, but on what might have happened just across the street. On the same morning Laci disappeared, December 24th, 2002, neighbors reported a burglary at the Medina home, located directly opposite the Peterson residence. 2 men were later arrested for that break-in, but police quickly ruled it unrelated to Laci's disappearance. They claimed the crime had taken place days after she went missing. Yet years later, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, LAIP, argued that timeline did not add up. Witness statements collected back then suggested the burglary might actually have occurred on Christmas Eve, not afterward. One neighbor even reported seeing a van parked strangely near the house that morning and a group of men loading items inside around the same time Laci was supposedly walking her dog. The defense theory proposes that Laci could have seen the burglary taking place, approached the men, and been taken away or silenced to prevent her from reporting what she saw. According to this version, her disappearance was a tragic coincidence, not a planned act by her husband. Critics of this theory point out several problems. First, police interviewed the burglars, and neither confessed to any involvement in Laci's case. Second, there was no physical evidence linking them to her. And third, investigators argued that the timing of the burglary had been confirmed through witness statements and stolen item recovery records. Still, the LAIP maintains that certain details deserve more scrutiny. They point to the burned-out van found in the same area shortly after the disappearance, the one with the mattress, containing untested stains as potentially connected. They also emphasize that Laci's remains were found many miles away in the bay, raising questions about how or why burglars from her neighborhood would have transported her there. The theory divides observers. Supporters believe the burglary explanation fills gaps the prosecution never convincingly closed, such as how Laci could have been abducted in broad daylight without anyone noticing Scott's involvement. Skeptics, however, see it as an attempt to create doubt without solid proof, noting that no new suspects have ever been identified. What keeps this theory alive is not just evidence, it is timing. Every detail, every minute on the morning of December 24th matters. If even one witness was right about when they saw those burglars, it could shift the timeline of Laci's disappearance by hours, and those few hours could mean everything. Whether coincidence or overlooked lead, the burglary theory remains one of the most debated aspects of the Peterson case. 2 decades later, it is a reminder that sometimes the truth might still be sitting in plain sight just across the street. By the middle of 2025, the Laci Peterson case once again reached a turning point, this time inside the California Court of Appeal. The court was asked to review the lengthy petition filed by the Los Angeles Innocence Project, LAIP, which sought to reopen Scott Peterson's case and allow full retesting of evidence. For months, the legal community watched closely. Could one of the most famous murder convictions in America's modern history actually be reopened? When the ruling finally arrived, it drew both attention and controversy. The Court of Appeal rejected most of the LAIP's claims, refusing to grant a new trial. The justices concluded that the defense had not provided enough compelling evidence to overturn the original conviction or prove Scott Peterson's innocence. However, they also stopped short of closing the door completely. In their written opinion, the judges acknowledged that certain elements, particularly related to DNA testing and physical evidence, deserved further examination. They authorized limited post-conviction review, meaning that some materials could still be retested using modern forensic methods under the supervision of lower courts. The court's decision was a blend of caution and control. On one hand, it reinforced the strength of the original verdict. On the other, it recognized that new science might someday reveal something the old investigation had missed. The reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters of Scott Peterson saw the partial approval as a victory proof that the system was finally willing to re-evaluate details that had long been ignored. They emphasized that even a small window for new testing could uncover significant findings. Meanwhile, Laci's family viewed the ruling differently. To them, it was another painful reopening of wounds that had never healed. They believed that the evidence against Scott had already been proven beyond doubt, and that every new appeal only prolonged their grief. In public statements, they urged the courts to let the case rest, calling the repeated challenges a cycle of false hope. Legal experts describe the outcome as typical of California's cautious appellate system. Courts rarely overturn convictions based on old evidence, unless something extraordinary, like a DNA mismatch or confession, clearly contradicts the original findings. The Laci petition, while thorough and emotionally powerful, was still built mostly on reinterpretation of existing facts rather than undisputed new proof. For now, the case sits in legal limbo. The testing of duct tape samples and other materials continues quietly under the court's limited authorization. But no dramatic reversal has occurred, no exoneration, no retrial. 2 decades after the disappearance that shook Modesto, the story remains caught between finality and uncertainty. The courts have spoken, but not conclusively. And as science evolves, so too does the possibility, however faint, that the story of Laci and Scott Peterson might still have one more chapter left to tell. 2 decades after the disappearance of Laci Peterson, legal experts, journalists, and forensic specialists continue to debate what the case truly represents. For some, it is a clear example of justice served. For others, it is a cautionary tale about how public pressure and media influence can shape a verdict long before a jury ever sits down. When the Los Angeles Innocence Project, LAIP, entered the scene, it reignited that old debate. Many defense attorneys and legal analysts praised the effort, noting that wrongful convictions are not rare even in high-profile cases. They argued that the Peterson case deserved a modern review because the original trial relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, not direct proof. No weapon, no witness, and no confession ever tied Scott Peterson to the crime. The jury's decision, they say, was built on behavior, not science on what the public felt about Scott, rather than what could be proven. Prominent legal commentators, however, offered a different view. They pointed out that circumstantial evidence, when strong and consistent, can be just as powerful as physical proof. Scott's affair, his suspicious actions after Laci's disappearance, and the coincidence of the bodies being found near his fishing spot created a pattern that jurors found impossible to ignore. It was not one piece of evidence, one prosecutor later said. It was the story they all told together. Forensic scientists, meanwhile, remain cautious. They acknowledge that modern DNA testing can sometimes overturn old verdicts, but not always. In many cases, retesting fails to yield new results, especially when evidence has been degraded by time or exposure to the elements. One forensic analyst explained that after 20 years in storage, it is possible that samples like duct tape or fibers may no longer contain usable DNA. Science can clarify, she said, but it can't always resurrect the past. Ethical discussions also surround the case. Some experts argue that reopening old convictions gives the public faith that justice is never static, that the truth can always be revisited. Others warn that constant appeals can re-traumatize victims' families and blur the line between justice and spectacle. Media analysts have also revisited how public perception influenced the case. In 2002 and 2003, the Peterson trial played out like a national soap opera, televised, dramatized, and dissected daily. Experts now agree that the intense coverage shaped how Americans viewed Scott long before the verdict was reached. The narrative of the charming husband-turned-killer became impossible to separate from the legal process itself. In the end, expert opinion remains divided but respectful. Some see Scott Peterson's continued fight as an important test of the justice system's integrity. Others view it as the final echo of a tragedy long decided. And somewhere between science, law, and human emotion lies the uneasy truth that even after 20 years, the line between guilt and doubt can remain blurred, and sometimes both can exist at once. Even after 20 years, the story of Laci Peterson continues to live on, not only in courtrooms, but in documentaries, podcasts, and social media debates that refuse to let it fade into history. Few criminal cases have captured public imagination as powerfully or as persistently. When the tragedy first unfolded in 2002, television networks turned the search for Laci into a national event. Morning shows covered it daily, news anchors broadcast from Modesto, and viewers across America followed each development as if they knew the family personally. In an era before social media, it became one of the first cases where 24-hour coverage shaped the emotional tone of the investigation itself. After Scott Peterson's arrest, the media narrative shifted again from sympathy to suspicion. True crime programs like Dateline NBC and 48 Hours produced special episodes, and tabloids published every rumor they could find. The case merged with American pop culture, books were written, talk shows debated guilt or innocence, and Laci's smiling photo became a haunting national symbol of trust betrayed. In later years, the conversation moved online. Podcasts dissected every detail of the trial, analyzing the evidence with the benefit of hindsight. Online forums and YouTube creators built communities around reviewing transcripts, body language, and police reports. Some focused on the inconsistencies of the prosecution's case, while others reasserted Scott's guilt as undeniable. The story had evolved into what some media critics call permanent trial culture, where public opinion continues to deliberate long after the verdict. Streaming platforms soon joined in. Netflix, Peacock, and Discovery Plus each released documentaries revisiting the case from new angles. The most recent, Face to Face with Scott Peterson 2024, included direct interviews with Scott himself, who continues to maintain his innocence. The program reignited old arguments, prompting new viewers, many too young to remember the original trial, to form opinions of their own. Social media platforms like TikTok and Reddit gave the story a new generation of detectives. Amateur analysts mapped Laci's walking routes, reviewed timelines, and debated the meaning of every phone call. Some treated it as a mystery still unsolved. Others saw it as a tragic lesson in how media can shape justice. Legal experts often warn that such attention can distort memory and justice alike. When a case becomes entertainment, nuance is often lost. Yet, there is no denying that public interest has also kept the case alive, ensuring that old evidence gets re-examined and new questions continue to be asked. In the end, the Peterson case has become more than a story of crime. It is a study of how a single event can live across decades through screens, headlines, and voices searching for closure. Whether driven by truth or curiosity, the world still watches and waits as the story of Laci and Scott Peterson continues to unfold, one retelling at a time. Today, more than 2 decades after the disappearance that shattered Modesto, the Laci Peterson case remains suspended between resolution and lingering doubt. The verdict has been rendered, the appeals have been argued, yet the story continues shaped by time, technology, and the enduring weight of human loss. Scott Peterson is still serving his sentence at a California state prison, now life imprisonment without parole, following the 2020 reversal of his death sentence. Once held on death row at San Quentin, he was transferred to Mule Creek State Prison, where he spends his days largely isolated from the outside world. According to prison records and interviews, he continues to maintain his innocence, working closely with the Los Angeles Innocence Project as their limited post-conviction testing unfolds. For his supporters, every new motion or lab report represents a flicker of hope, a belief that modern forensics could one day uncover something the original investigation missed. They describe Scott as calm, introspective, and focused on proving that his trial was built on perception rather than proof. For his critics, however, Those same appeals feel like an endless attempt to rewrite a tragedy already decided by evidence and by law. Meanwhile, Laci's family continues to honor her memory quietly. They still live with the shadow of a case that has never truly ended in public view. Over the years, they have spoken about how Laci's laughter, warmth, and generosity defined her life far more than the circumstances of her death. The foundation established in her name helps raise awareness for missing person cases and supports families going through similar trauma. For them, each new appeal reopens a wound they have spent years trying to close. Legally, the case is now in a state of slow movement. The appellate courts have denied major retrial requests, but allowed limited DNA testing to proceed a process that could take months or even years. The results of those tests, once complete, may determine whether any part of the case can be revisited. Most experts believe a full reversal remains unlikely, yet they also admit that DNA science has surprised the justice system before. Public interest has not faded. Documentaries, podcasts, and social media debates continue to discuss every development, proving that the story has become larger than any single verdict. It now represents questions about trust, truth, and the limits of certainty in the modern justice system. As of 2025, there is no new trial, no confession, and no definitive breakthrough. Just a man serving his sentence, a family living with loss, and a nation still captivated by a case that refuses to rest. And perhaps that is what makes the Laci Peterson story endure, not just the tragedy, but the search for truth that still flickers beneath it. A search that even after 20 years has yet to find its final answer. And so, after more than 20 years, the story of Laci Peterson stands as one of America's most haunting modern tragedies, not only for what happened, but for what it continues to make us question. It began as the disappearance of a young mother full of life and hope, a woman whose smile came to symbolize the heartbreak of an entire nation. It became a courtroom battle watched by millions, a test of what we believe about justice, marriage, and truth. And now, decades later, it remains a story still unfolding, caught between science and suspicion, faith and doubt, loss and the longing to finally understand. Whether one believes Scott Peterson is guilty beyond all question, or that there is more to the story than was ever proven, one thing is certain: no verdict can restore what was lost. Laci's family carries her memory in every season, every birthday, every quiet moment that might have belonged to her son, Connor. For them, the case is more than headlines or theories. It is a reminder of love, of absence, and of how deeply a single life can touch so many others. As the years pass, new evidence may still emerge, or perhaps it never will. But even if the final truth remains hidden, the lessons of this case endure, that justice is not just a verdict, but a pursuit, one that demands patience, honesty, and humility from everyone who seeks it. Thank you for joining me through this long, complex journey, a story of mystery, heartbreak, and resilience. If you'd like to explore more cases like this one, where history and humanity meet in unexpected ways, make sure to stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, take care of yourselves, cherish the people you love, and remember, behind every case, there are real lives, real families, and real stories that deserve to be told with compassion. Good night, everyone.